Hello, everyone. Today we'll be presenting on chapter 11 of the textbook, which talks about business cycles. Next slide, please. So this is our table of contents. As you can see, it will be divided into two. Firstly, we will be talking about business cycle theory, and then we will be relating that to a real life example, which will be about the implications of Biden's financial aid package. Next slide, please. So to begin, we will be talking about the business cycle theory. What is a business cycle? Basically, a business cycle is a periodic fluctuation in macroeconomic variables, particularly GDP. The fluctuations are measured in relation to the trend level of output, represented by the equation y equals AFKL, which roots from Solo's growth model, which was y equals AFKH, where K stood for capital and H stood for human labor. Next slide. So whenever the output gap, which is the difference between the current GDP and the trend GDP, happens to be positive, it is associated with rising inflation. On the other hand, whenever there's a negative gap, it tends to represent a weakening inflation. Next slide. And what is the trend level of output? Next slide, please. So the trend level of output, also referred to as the potential output, can be categorized and calculated in different ways, such as expansion, recession, growth recession, and depression. And expansion is defined as output above the trend. And on the other hand, a recession is whenever a period of economic output below trend. Now, the official definition of a recession, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US, is two successive quarters of negative economic growth. Nonetheless, this definition definitely imposes some limitations and keeps politicians, scholars, and economists arguing. Next slide. Okay, so moreover, as a result of multiple macro and microeconomic variables, real GDP has been logically less fluctuating in developed countries, yet no matter what, fluctuations have always been inevitable, and this has allowed multiple theories to be developed, such as the Frisch-Slutsky paradigm, which states that both impulse and propagation mechanisms are what eventually trigger fluctuations and one-time shocks, which eventually become persistent business cycle fluctuations. Now, please, you should note that there's two types of fluctuations in regards to their deviations. First, we have pro-cyclical fluctuations, which go towards the same direction as GDP. This could be consumption, investment, and employment. And we also have counter-cyclical fluctuations, which are those variables that reflect negative deviations from the general trend of GDP, such as Okun's law, which depicts the relationship between unemployment and GDP over time.
In continuation, I will expand on two differing economic models to explain business cycles. Next slide, please. Firstly, we have the real business cycle theory that proposes a formula of output built upon the new classical model, which highlights how output, shown as Y, is dependent upon technological progress, natural resources, and both physical and human capital. Important to note how the only one affecting long run is technology, also referred to as A. These theorists believe the reason for business cycles are the impact of total factor productivity shocks, like supply factors and technology. Critics argue two main topics when analyzing the real business cycle theory. Firstly, its rejection of demand shocks, influence in the economy, and its use of the same model to explain growth and demand shocks. Secondly, how positive technological developments tend to have an influence over the several spread periods of in the economy, in contrast to the idea portrayed in this theory of technological shocks impulsing business cycles. In the next slide, we see the new Keynesian models. These were formed in contemporary mainstream economics, taking elements from both previous schools of economics. Keynes can be said to have taken inspiration from past ideologies such as the real business cycle theory. However, it can be seen further how he focuses on the presence of nominal rigidities, in other words, known as sticky prices and sticky wages. As a result of these nominal rigidities, the economy wouldn't be able to adequately adjust to changes in supply and demand, leading to the final formation of business cycles. Indeed, supply and demand are considered the main drivers of such fluctuations. Keynes additionally believed in the implementation and increase of government expenditure to help financial markets, therefore, the addition of a financial system in the economy. Lastly, Keynes is recognized for the development of the AS model that we see on the slide. This explains short run fluctuations in economic activity as well as their long run trends. Likewise, the equilibrium of three different markets: the goods and services market, the financial market, and the labor market. As this model reflects the relationship between the quantity of output and price level, we can also use this to determine the CPI and the real GDP. In the next slide, lastly, we can see the shifts in AD and AS curves as a result of an increase in demand and or a decrease in supply. The AD curve represents the quantity of all goods and services demanded in the economy, represented along with the price with a negative slope. It will shift as a result of changes to any of the GDP's components. On the other hand, the AS curve is upward sloping as an increase in price will lead to an increase in quantity of goods and services supplied in the economy. In the long run, as equilibrium and employment stay at the natural level, this becomes a vertical line.
Moving on, we're going to examine an article that is titled The Macroeconomic Implications of Biden's $1.9 trillion fiscal package, which is written by Wendy Edelberg and Louise Scheiner. The Biden administration has proposed a stimulus plan composed of $1.9 trillion in federal spending to ease the ongoing crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The article estimates that the package will boost economic growth as measured by real GDP. Their estimate stipulates a 4% increase by the end of 2021. The package is actually divided into four categories to which it is being spent. The first being COVID-19 containment and vaccination, aid to local government, and federal assistance. The second is direct aid to families, which is the largest component of the plan of about $600 billion. Third being aid to financially vulnerable households, and lastly, aid to businesses. The article projects that if the Biden package were enacted, GDP would reach the Congressional Budget Office, CBO's pre-pandemic GDP projection after the third quarter of 2021. As federal aid recipients raise their purchase of goods and services, companies gear up production and recruit more employees than they were otherwise would, raising production and GDP and putting upward market pressure. For each initial dollar of investment, the resulting rise in real, inflation-adjusted, of course, GDP is referred to as the fiscal multiplier. The effect of an extra dollar of federal aid on GDP, whether for individuals, corporations, or state and local governments, depends on how efficiently the federal aid is distributed, how often and how quickly each dollar earned is spent, known as the marginal consumption propensity, MPC, and how high the multiplier we've spoken about is. The article uses a set of multipliers the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, uses to measure the impact of increased demand on GDP when monetary policy is very accommodating. At the lower end, which we can see here on the slide, the multiplier results in a 0.5 or 50 cents rise in real GDP for every dollar of aggregate demand increase. At the higher end, the multiplier results in a $2.5 rise in real GDP for every dollar of aggregate demand increase. Our $1.9 trillion package projected results reflect a weighted average of those multipliers with 60% weight on the low multiplier and 40% weight on the high multiplier. That stems from the writer's judgment that supply constraints would lead to more downward pressure from inflation on real economic activity than is normal when the economy reacts to fiscal stimulus during periods of very accommodating monetary policy. The writer expects real GDP to rise 4% from the fourth quarter of 2020 to the fourth quarter of 2021 and 2.5% in 2022, assuming that no additional fiscal support is enacted. that is within the range of economic forecasts projection. The many factors buffeting the economy are expressed in that forecast. For example, the latest fiscal support package passed by Congress at the end of 2020, which totaled $900 billion, is stimulating real GDP growth in the near term. Nonetheless, real GDP growth, on the other hand, is constrained by a resurgence of COVID-19 cases and new COVID-19 strands.
The economic effect of the Biden package of real GDP can be divided into the four main categories of aid implemented by the American president. Indeed, it can be estimated how the COVID-19 containment and vaccination, aid to state and local governments, and increased federal spending are projected to receive the largest contribution, amounting roughly up to $750 billion. Contrarily, business aid receives a contribution of only $150 billion, being the category that collects the smallest amount of money. This is mainly due to the smaller effect on GDP per dollar of outlay spent. The largest increase of GDP is projected to occur in the fourth quarter of 2021. Following, it can be seen how the slope of the boost is predicted to decrease in the following years. The GDP effect changes over time for different reasons. Firstly, federal outlays are given over a few quarters and not at one time. Secondly, households will probably spread their spending over 2 years as they expect a temporary rise in prices due to the outlays. Finally, fiscal multipliers take time to increase production and GDP. Between 2021 and 2023, aid to financially vulnerable households is predicted to have the strongest influence on GDP, boosting cumulative GDP by almost $1.2. Contrarily, aid to business is predicted to increase GDP of only 30 cents per dollar invested, giving the smallest contribution. Furthermore, COVID containment, aid to state and local governments, and federal spending have a cumulative effect of an extra 70 cents. Similarly, aid to families can be predicted to have increased GDP by approximately 80 cents. As a consequence of the $1.9 trillion package, real GDP can be expected to grow strongly in 2021, slightly reduce in the middle of 2022, and finally in 2023 grow again. Indeed, with the help of this package, by the fourth quarter of 2021, GDP will already be at the pre-pandemic level and will grow from there onwards. Next slide, please. This research, however, faces several uncertainties. Firstly, the path of the GDP is hard to predict, and as it depends heavily also on the vaccine rate and possible stronger mutations of the COVID-19 virus. Secondly, the positive output gap will likely increase inflation, which would probably overcome the 2% target imposed by the Federal Reserve. This could possibly lead to a reduction in the fiscal multipliers when concerning private sector borrowers. Moreover, the increase in demand could result in an increase in imports rather than an increase in domestic production. Thirdly, the fiscal aid package could possibly end up in an increase of GDP above its potential, which is the maximum sustainable level of output. This could lead to several issues as overinvestment in the short term due to high expectations. However, when coming to the realization that the new demand level will indeed go decreasing, businesses will experience a sudden contraction of investment, further hurting the economy. Next slide, please. Well, now we would like to leave you with the final two questions. Firstly, how could you apply the business cycle model in light of COVID-19 to your own country? And secondly, how does the case of COVID-19 demonstrate the limitations of the business cycle model and its uncertainty? Thank you, guys. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.